There is a quiet truth that rarely finds a place in a noisy world. It does not announce itself, does not seek agreement, and does not demand recognition. It simply exists, steady and unmoving beneath the surface of human experience. The truth is this: the strongest ones often walk alone, not because they reject connection, but because they are no longer afraid of their own presence. From an early age, we are taught that strength looks like visibility. That power comes from numbers. That success is measured by how many walk beside us, approve of us, or echo our choices. We learn to associate solitude with weakness, loneliness, or failure. But Zen gently turns this belief upside down. It invites us to look closer, not at appearances, but at the inner posture of a person who can stand without leaning. Walking alone does not mean isolation. It means self-trust. It means the ability to remain whole without constant reassurance. The strongest ones are not those surrounded by constant agreement, but those who can move forward even when understanding is absent. Zen teachings remind us that every authentic path begins in solitude. Before words form, before identities harden, before belonging becomes a concern, awareness stands alone. When you sit quietly with yourself, stripped of roles and expectations, what remains is not emptiness but presence. This presence does not need witnesses. There is a reason many Zen monks practiced long periods of solitude, not as an escape from the world, but as a return to what is real. In silence and aloneness, the mind reveals its habits. The need to perform softens. The fear of being unseen dissolves. What remains is clarity. Walking alone requires courage because it confronts the deepest human fear, the fear of being unsupported. But Zen teaches that true support does not come from outside. It arises from alignment within. When you are aligned with your values, your awareness, and your truth, you are never truly alone. The strongest ones often reach a point where external validation no longer directs their steps. They may still appreciate connection, but they are no longer driven by it. Their decisions come from inner listening rather than external approval. This kind of strength is quiet. It does not need to be defended. It does not rush to explain itself. It moves deliberately, aware that not everyone will understand and at peace with that reality. Zen speaks often of walking your own path, not the path expected of you, not the path admired by others, but the one that feels honest when you are alone with yourself. This path can feel lonely at first because it often diverges from familiar roads, but solitude here is not emptiness. It is integrity. There is a Zen story about a young monk who asked his teacher why the path felt so lonely the deeper he walked. The teacher replied, "Because fewer people are willing to walk honestly." Strength in this sense is not about endurance alone. It is about authenticity. When you choose truth over comfort, solitude becomes inevitable. Not because you push others away, but because alignment naturally narrows your circle. The strongest ones understand this without resentment. They do not chase belonging at the cost of self-respect. Walking alone also reveals how much of human behavior is driven by fear of standing apart. Many stay in situations, relationships, and identities that no longer fit simply to avoid being alone. Zen does not judge this. It simply points out the cost. When you abandon yourself to avoid solitude, you carry a deeper loneliness wherever you go. The strongest ones choose a different path. They accept temporary aloneness rather than permanent self-betrayal. They understand that solitude can be a teacher, not a punishment. In Zen practice, sitting alone is not considered isolation. It is communion with what is. When you remove distractions, you begin to hear your inner rhythms. You notice what thoughts arise without external influence. You learn which desires are borrowed and which are true. Walking alone strengthens discernment. Without constant noise, you become sensitive to misalignment. You recognize when something feels forced, performative, or hollow. This sensitivity is not weakness. It is refinement. There is a moment in personal growth when familiar companions no longer resonate. Conversations feel repetitive. Values feel mismatched. You may feel guilt for outgrowing certain spaces. Zen reminds us that growth does not require justification. Trees do not apologize for growing taller. The strongest ones allow themselves to evolve, even when it means walking without company for a while. They trust that alignment will eventually attract resonance, but they do not rush the process. Walking alone also cultivates responsibility. Without others to blame, distract, or lean on, you face yourself directly. This can be uncomfortable, but it is also empowering. You begin to see how your reactions shape your experience. You stop outsourcing your peace. Zen teaches that liberation begins when you stop expecting the world to hold you together. When you learn to sit with discomfort without fleeing, strength quietly takes root. This does not mean rejecting love or connection. The strongest ones love deeply, but they do not cling. They do not lose themselves to keep others close. Their love is spacious, not desperate. There is a subtle difference between being alone and being independent. Independence can still carry resistance, a need to prove self-sufficiency. Walking alone in the Zen sense is softer. It is relaxed. It does not perform strength. It rests in it. As you walk this path, you may notice others projecting assumptions onto you. They may call you distant, cold, or detached. Zen teaches that projections say more about the observer than the observed. The strongest ones do not absorb these labels. They let them pass like clouds. Walking alone sharpens intuition. When you are not constantly influenced by others' opinions, your inner guidance grows clearer. You begin to recognize when something is right for you, even if it makes no sense to anyone else. This clarity is not loud. It does not argue, it simply knows. The path of the strongest ones is not glamorous. It does not promise applause. It often involves walking through uncertainty without reassurance. But Zen reminds us that certainty is rarely a prerequisite for truth. Trust is. As this understanding deepens, solitude becomes less frightening. You begin to appreciate the richness of your own presence. Silence feels supportive rather than empty. Time alone feels nourishing rather than lacking. Walking alone becomes a choice rather than a condition, a conscious alignment rather than a circumstance imposed upon you. And yet, this is only the beginning of the teaching. There are deeper layers to explore, moments where walking alone is tested, misunderstood, and refined. Moments where solitude transforms from necessity into strength, and strength into wisdom. As the path continues, walking alone begins to reveal its deeper challenges. The initial quiet strength that comes from choosing solitude over conformity soon meets resistance, not only from the world but from within. This is where the teaching becomes more subtle, and where many turn back. When you walk alone long enough, you begin to notice how deeply conditioned the need for companionship and approval truly is. Even after making a conscious choice to stand on your own, the mind still searches for witnesses. It wonders who sees your effort, who understands your sacrifice, who acknowledges your growth. Zen does not criticize this impulse. It simply invites awareness of it. Strength does not mean the absence of longing. It means the ability to remain present with longing without allowing it to dictate your direction. At this stage, solitude may feel heavier, not because it is wrong, but because illusions are dissolving. When you no longer distract yourself with constant interaction, unresolved emotions rise to the surface. Doubt appears. Old insecurities knock gently, then insistently. The mind may whisper that walking alone was a mistake. Zen teaches that this is not a sign to retreat. It is a sign that you are finally meeting yourself honestly. There is a story of a Zen practitioner who left his village to live in the mountains alone. For the first year, he felt peaceful. The second year, restless. The third year, deeply uncomfortable. He considered returning many times. When he finally spoke to his teacher about his struggle, the teacher smiled and said, "The guests have arrived." The guests were his unexamined fears, attachments, and identities. Solitude had not created them, it had revealed them. The strongest ones understand this phase. They do not romanticize walking alone. They recognize that solitude removes external mirrors, forcing you to confront the inner ones. This is not easy, but it is transformative. When you walk alone, there is no one to immediately affirm your choices. You learn to make peace with uncertainty. You begin to trust your inner compass even when it trembles. This is where true strength is forged, not in confidence, but in sincerity. Zen reminds us that confidence often comes after the fact. Before it, there is only willingness. Walking alone also exposes the subtle ways the ego seeks superiority. There can be a temptation to believe that solitude makes you wiser, deeper, or more evolved than others. Zen gently dissolves this illusion as well. True solitude humbles rather than elevates. It reveals how much you still depend on comparison, even in isolation. The strongest ones do not use walking alone as a badge of honor. They do not announce it. They live it quietly, knowing that strength does not require contrast. As time passes, you may notice that some relationships fall away without drama, not because of conflict, but because resonance fades. Conversations no longer flow naturally. Priorities diverge. This can bring grief. Zen does not rush this grief away. It honors it. Grief is not weakness. It is the echo of care. Walking alone does not mean you never valued connection. It means you are no longer willing to hold onto what no longer aligns. The strongest ones allow endings to be gentle. They do not force closeness out of nostalgia. They trust that what is real does not need to be held tightly. Another test arises when others question your path. Friends may worry. Family may misunderstand. Society may interpret your independence as withdrawal or rebellion. The urge to explain yourself returns, to justify your choices so they make sense to others. Zen teaches restraint here. Not everyone needs to understand your path. Explanations offered prematurely can dilute your clarity. Sometimes silence is the most honest response, not because you have nothing to say, but because your path is still unfolding. Walking alone requires patience with misunderstanding. The strongest ones accept that clarity is not always immediate and validation is not always necessary. There is also a quieter challenge: boredom. When the noise of constant engagement fades, life may feel simpler, slower, even dull at times. The mind, accustomed to stimulation, resists this simplicity. It looks for distraction. Zen invites you to stay. In boredom, depth reveals itself. When nothing is happening, everything is happening. Subtle sensations become noticeable. Small joys emerge. Awareness expands. The strongest ones do not flee from stillness. They learn to inhabit it. As solitude matures, it reshapes how you relate to effort. Without an audience, motivation becomes intrinsic. You do what matters because it matters, not because it will be noticed. This quiet dedication builds a different kind of strength, one that is steady rather than dramatic. Zen calls this effortless effort, action without attachment to outcome. Walking alone also teaches you to listen more deeply when you do encounter others. You are no longer rushing to speak or to be seen. You engage more fully, more selectively. Relationships become fewer but richer. You stop seeking to be understood by everyone and start valuing understanding itself. At this stage, you may find yourself comfortable with long stretches of silence. Not because you are detached, but because your inner world has become spacious. Silence is no longer awkward, it is familiar. The strongest ones recognize that solitude is not an identity. It is a season, a posture, a way of relating to life. They do not cling to it rigidly. They remain open but not dependent. Zen teaches that attachment can form around anything, even solitude. When walking alone becomes a shield or an excuse to avoid vulnerability, it loses its wisdom. True strength remains flexible. This flexibility allows you to walk alone without hardening, to be self-sufficient without becoming closed, to be independent without becoming distant. As this balance develops, you begin to sense when to step forward and when to step back, when to engage and when to remain solitary. Walking alone no longer feels like separation from the world. It feels like alignment within it. The strongest ones reach a point where they no longer define themselves by whether they are accompanied or alone. They are rooted enough to meet either with equanimity. But the path continues. There is a deeper layer still, where walking alone becomes less about physical solitude and more about inner independence. Where strength is tested not by isolation, but by presence in the midst of others without losing yourself. As the journey deepens, walking alone begins to take on a quieter, more internal meaning. At this stage, solitude is no longer defined by physical distance from others. It becomes an inner posture. You can be surrounded by people, responsibilities, conversations, and noise, yet remain inwardly alone in the most grounded and stable way. This is where true strength is revealed. The strongest ones eventually discover that walking alone does not require retreating from life. It requires standing firmly within it without dissolving into the expectations, emotions, and identities of others. This is far more difficult than physical solitude. Anyone can isolate themselves. Very few can remain internally independent while fully present in the world. Zen speaks often of the lotus that grows in muddy water without being stained by it. This is the essence of walking alone among many. You are immersed in life, yet not owned by it. At this stage, the need to be understood fades even further. You begin to recognize that misunderstanding is not a failure of communication. It is simply a natural consequence of different inner worlds. When you no longer depend on being seen correctly, you stop shaping yourself for the comfort of others. This does not make you careless. It makes you honest. You speak when words are needed and remain silent when they are not. You act without broadcasting your intentions. You make choices without constantly seeking confirmation. This quiet autonomy is unsettling to some. People are accustomed to visible alignment, verbal reassurance, and shared narratives. When you no longer participate in these unconsciously, it can create discomfort. The strongest ones allow that discomfort to exist without trying to resolve it. There is a subtle loneliness that can arise here, not from lack of connection, but from clarity. When you see more clearly, fewer illusions remain to bond over. Superficial connections lose their appeal. Conversations that once felt normal may now feel empty or repetitive. Zen does not label this as superiority. It sees it as natural refinement. As awareness sharpens, you become sensitive to energy. You feel when interactions drain you and when they nourish you. You begin to choose carefully where you place your attention. This selectiveness is not avoidance. It is respect for your inner state. Walking alone in this sense means you no longer abandon yourself to maintain harmony. This is often when people accuse you of being distant, changed, or detached. They may say you are no longer the same, and they are right. You are no longer fragmented. The strongest ones accept that growth alters how you are perceived. They do not cling to old versions of themselves to keep others comfortable. Another layer of this path is learning to hold your own emotional weight. When challenges arise, you no longer immediately seek someone to lean on, not because support is wrong, but because you trust your capacity to sit with discomfort. You allow emotions to arise, move, and settle without outsourcing your stability. Zen teaches that emotions are visitors, not authorities. This self-reliance does not eliminate connection, it purifies it. When you do share, it comes from openness, not need. From presence, not desperation. Walking alone here also means letting go of the urge to rescue others from their paths. You begin to see that everyone must walk their own road, face their own confusion, and awaken in their own time. Advice offered prematurely can become interference. The strongest ones learn to witness without controlling. This can feel painful at first, especially with loved ones. Compassion does not disappear, but it becomes quieter, less dramatic, more respectful. You stop confusing care with intervention. Zen describes this as compassion without attachment. At this stage, identity loosens significantly. You no longer define yourself rigidly by roles, labels, or stories. You perform your responsibilities, but they do not confine you. You participate in life, but you are not consumed by it. This is a profound form of freedom. Walking alone internally also reveals how little you actually need. Many desires fall away naturally, not through force but through understanding. You see how much effort was spent chasing approval, security, or belonging, and you realize that what you were seeking was always available in stillness. The strongest ones do not renounce the world. They simply stop grasping it. With this shift, fear diminishes. Not because life becomes predictable, but because your sense of self is no longer dependent on external conditions. Success and failure lose their absolute power. Praise and criticism pass through without lodging deeply. Zen calls this equanimity. Equanimity does not mean indifference. It means balance. You still care, but you are no longer destabilized by outcomes. You engage fully, yet remain inwardly free. Walking alone in this way allows you to stand firm in moments of pressure. When groupthink dominates, you can remain grounded in your own perception. When emotions escalate, you can remain calm. When chaos surrounds you, you become a quiet center rather than a reactive force. The strongest ones are often unnoticed in these moments. They do not demand attention. Their strength expresses itself as steadiness. Over time, people may begin to feel safe around you without knowing why. Your presence does not judge or cling. It does not compete or compare. It simply is. This is the paradox of walking alone. The more internally independent you become, the more naturally others are drawn to your calm. But you no longer need that draw. You welcome connection without chasing it. There is a deep peace that settles here, not dramatic or euphoric, but steady and reliable. A sense that you can meet life as it is, without armor and without collapse. This peace is not something you achieve. It emerges when resistance ends. Walking alone at this level means trusting yourself completely. Trusting your perception, your timing, your inner signals. Even when you make mistakes, you remain intact. You learn from experience rather than punishing yourself. Zen reminds us that falling is also part of the path. The strongest ones do not strive to appear strong. They allow vulnerability without losing grounding. They allow softness without becoming unstable. As this integration deepens, walking alone no longer feels like a choice. It feels like a natural state. You are alone in the sense that no one can walk your inner path for you. And yet, you are deeply connected to life itself. Eventually, the idea of walking alone begins to dissolve entirely. What once felt like separation now reveals itself as simplicity. There is no loneliness here, no sense of loss. Only a quiet recognition that the path was never about distance from others, but closeness to what is real. At this stage, the strongest ones no longer describe themselves as independent, self-made, or solitary. Those labels fall away just like the need for approval once did. What remains is presence. Plain, unadorned, and sufficient. Zen often points to this moment without naming it. The moment when seeking ends, not because everything has been achieved, but because nothing is missing. Walking alone was never about proving strength. It was about shedding dependence on illusion, dependence on being followed, agreed with, mirrored, or validated. Once those needs dissolve, the sense of isolation disappears as well. There is simply life unfolding, and you moving with it rather than against it. You begin to notice that effort softens here. Actions arise naturally from clarity instead of tension. Decisions feel less dramatic. You do what needs to be done and let go of the rest. There is no need to narrate your life, justify your choices, or explain your path. Silence becomes a companion rather than a refuge. The strongest ones are deeply at ease with silence, not because they reject connection, but because they are no longer afraid of being with themselves. Silence is not empty. It is full of subtle intelligence. It reveals things words often conceal. In silence, you see how much of human struggle comes from unnecessary resistance. from wanting life to match a mental image instead of meeting it as it is, from trying to control outcomes instead of responding to conditions. This understanding brings a gentle humility. You no longer feel separate from the flow of existence. You see that every person, no matter how lost or reactive, is moving according to causes and conditions they may not yet understand. This softens judgment without dulling discernment. Compassion here is effortless. Not the kind that rushes to fix, but the kind that allows. The strongest ones do not impose their clarity on others. They trust that insight unfolds when the time is right. This is why they can walk among confusion without becoming confused. They no longer need the world to make sense in order to remain peaceful. Another subtle shift occurs at this point. You stop measuring progress. There is no comparison to past versions of yourself, no future self to become. Growth continues, but without the tension of self-improvement. You are no longer trying to arrive somewhere else. Zen calls this returning home. Walking alone led you here, not as a destination, but as a recognition that the ground you were seeking has always been beneath your feet. The strongest ones live simply, not necessarily in lifestyle, but in inner movement. They respond rather than react. They listen more than they speak. They observe without immediately labeling. This simplicity makes life feel lighter even when circumstances are heavy. When challenges arise, they meet them directly, without dramatization, without avoidance, without self-pity. Not because they are immune to pain, but because they no longer add unnecessary layers of suffering. They feel fully and move forward gently. This way of being does not attract attention, but it commands respect. Not the loud kind, but the quiet trust that others sense intuitively. People may not understand your choices, but they feel the steadiness behind them. You no longer explain your solitude or defend your independence. You simply live it. At this stage, relationships take on a new quality. You connect without clinging. You care without losing yourself. You give without depletion. You receive without attachment. You walk together when paths align, and you part peacefully when they diverge. There is no resentment in separation, no drama in endings, just gratitude for what was shared and acceptance of what is no longer needed. This is emotional maturity at its deepest level. Walking alone here means you are no longer walking against anything, not against others, not against yourself, not against life. There is a profound sense of cooperation with reality. Zen teaches that when you stop resisting the river, it carries you effortlessly. You begin to trust life again, not blindly but deeply. You trust that you can meet whatever arises. You trust your capacity to respond wisely. You trust that even uncertainty has a place. Fear no longer dominates your decisions. You may still feel it, but it no longer leads. Awareness leads, presence leads. This is why the strongest ones often appear calm in situations that unsettle others. They are not braver by nature. They are simply less divided within themselves. Division creates fear. Integration creates strength. As you look back, you may realize that what once felt like isolation was actually initiation, a necessary stripping away of noise, dependency, and false belonging. Walking alone was not punishment. It was preparation. Preparation for clarity. Preparation for freedom. Preparation for peace. The strongest ones do not seek to stand apart. They simply stop pretending to belong where they no longer resonate. And in doing so, they find a deeper belonging, not to a group or identity, but to life itself. This belonging does not require agreement. It does not demand recognition. It does not depend on being chosen. It exists quietly, steadily, without conditions. You are here. That is enough. In this understanding, the phrase, "the strongest ones walk alone," loses its edge. It no longer points to solitude as a badge of honor. It points to inner wholeness. You were never truly alone. You were learning to stop leaning on what could not support you. And when you finally stand without needing to lean, you discover something unexpected. You are supported by everything. This is the end of the path and the beginning of nothing new. Life continues as it always has, but you meet it differently now, with fewer demands, with clearer eyes, with a softer heart. Walking alone has led you back to yourself. And from here, every step is steady,